When Emperor Nero lost his wife, he didn't grieve quietly. He set the world's most expensive bonfire. It smelled like Christmas. Long before the world's most expensive bonfire, cinnamon belonged to the gods. In Egypt's temples, priests opened the Ebers papyrus, its pages already ancient by 1550 BCE, and measured out cane, a fragrant bark so precious it was counted among the secrets of embalming. They mixed it with myrrh and resins, painting the bodies of pharaohs for their journey to eternity. Cinnamon's scent was a passport to the afterlife, its oil sealed inside linen and stone, trusted to outlast even the pyramids. Hieroglyphs from the same era list cane alongside gold and lapis, reserved for offerings to the divine. To touch it was to enter a closed circle of sacred power. In the temple inventories of Papyrus Leiden Y8, cinnamon appears as tribute, tallied with the seriousness of a royal tax, no kitchen spice. This was the perfume of gods and kings, invisible and indispensable. Across the desert, Hebrew scribes set down the Book of Exodus. In a single verse, they named cinnamon as an ingredient in the holy anointing oil, chica. The formula was not for ordinary hands. Only the high priest could prepare it, and the penalty for imitation was exile. The scent of cinnamon, rising from the altar, marked the boundary between the sacred and the profane. In both Egypt and Israel, cinnamon's true origin was shrouded in mystery. What mattered was its aura, a strip of bark, worth more than silver, kept behind temple doors and guarded by silence. Before cinnamon became a commodity, it was a ritual, one that promised immortality with every breath. Arab traders, holding the keys to cinnamon's mystery, understood that a good story could be worth its weight in silver. They spun a legend for the Greek world. Somewhere beyond Arabia, giant birds, the cinnamology, built their nests from precious bark, high on unreachable cliffs. The only way to harvest cinnamon, so the tale went, was to trick these birds into dropping their fragrant cargo. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, dutifully recorded the story, passing it along like a merchant's receipt. The myth did more than entertain, it protected a monopoly. If cinnamon came from the ends of the earth, guarded by monstrous birds, who would dare question the price? Pliny the Elder, ever the skeptic, was not so easily fooled. In the 1st century CE, he called out the fabrication in his Natural History. It was not birds, but Arab traders themselves who carried cinnamon in secret, tucked away in hidden bags. For Pliny, the real marvel was not the cinnamon bird, but the profit margins. He saw through the smoke, but his rational voice was drowned out by the allure of the myth. Centuries later, Byzantine scholars copied Herodotus's tale into the Suda, and medieval compilers in Europe repeated it in their encyclopedias. By the 14th century, the story of the cinnamon bird was still circling, outlasting empires and outpacing fact. The myth had become a form of price armor. No one haggles with a legend. Even as trade routes shifted and new powers rose, the fiction clung to cinnamon's bark as tightly as the resin itself. In the world of ancient commerce, truth was negotiable, but a good story was non-refundable. On a summer day in 65 CE, the air above Rome thickened with a sweetness no street had ever known. Nero, emperor and self-styled god, stood over the funeral pyre of Poppaea Sabina. Ancient sources, Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio, compete to describe the scene, but all agree on one point. Nero ordered the city's entire annual reserve of cinnamon to be cast into the flames. Suetonius writes that it was enough to perfume every home in Rome for a year. Tacitus calls it a flood of costly spice, a public outpouring of grief measured in incense, not tears. Dio, always the dramatist, insists the cinnamon came from India at enormous expense, a gesture as theatrical as any staged in the amphitheater. The scent must have rolled in waves, sweet, sharp, impossible to ignore, clinging to marble, drifting through the alleys, settling on the togas of onlookers. For a moment, the city became an altar, its people enveloped in the same aroma once reserved for gods and pharaohs. The cost was staggering. Cinnamon, at times worth 15 times its weight in silver, was not a luxury, but a statement. Nero's fire was more than mourning. It was power, made visible and inhaled by all. Historians have argued for centuries about what drove Nero: grief, vanity, or a taste for spectacle. The sources never quite agree, but the smoke left no room for doubt. Rome had witnessed a ritual of excess, a year's worth of myth and money gone in a single blaze. The city would not forget the scent of empire. When Vasco da Gama's ships rounded the Cape and reached Calicut in 1498, the world's oldest trade secret began to unravel. Cinnamon, once cloaked in myth and guarded by Arab merchants, now sailed straight into European hands. The Portuguese wasted no time. By 1505, royal envoys in Ceylon demanded an annual tribute: 125 tons of cinnamon, peeled and delivered under threat. The bark that once perfumed pharaohs' tombs now filled the holds of Lisbon-bound carracks, each stick counted, each shipment taxed. Extraction was no longer a matter of legend or ritual. It was quota, contract, and punishment for those who failed to meet the mark. But the monopoly only tightened. In 1640, Dutch East India Company officers landed on Ceylon's shores. Their ledgers became law. VOC records show every cinnamon tree registered, every laborer watched. Unauthorized peeling meant death. Captain Johan van Rijk, arriving in 1652, wrote that from 8 sea miles away, the island's scent reached the deck. Ceylon, he said, could be smelled before it was seen. The VOC measured their power not in stories, but in sticks, quotas, and the sharp discipline of a corporate empire. The sea route had broken one monopoly only to forge another, colder and far more efficient. In 1796, British troops landed on Ceylon's cinnamon coast, ending a century of Dutch control with the stroke of a colonial administrator's pen. The British did not burn the forests or guard every quill with the threat of death. Instead, they opened the gates to the market. Plantations expanded, new peeling sheds appeared along the coast, and the old monopoly, once enforced by ledgers and muskets, began to unravel. Cinnamon, for centuries a prize for kings and merchants, started trickling down the social ladder. Between 1800 and 1820, the price of cinnamon in Europe fell by nearly a third. London grocers, once locked out by high tariffs and VOC quotas, now stocked cinnamon for anyone who could pay a few shillings. British trade records from the early 19th century chart the shift. Annual exports soared, and the spice that once perfumed the tombs of pharaohs now flavored the puddings of clerks and shopkeepers. What had been the scent of empire became an everyday indulgence, traded by men who measured success not in myths or rituals, but in tons, pounds, and falling prices. On the grocery shelf, cinnamon looks simple enough, a neat curl of brown bark, ready for the grinder or the simmering pot. But the story behind those sticks is anything but ordinary. Most cinnamon sold today is not true Ceylon cinnamon at all, but Cassia, thicker and harder, a single rolled layer instead of the delicate papery quills that unfurl from the real thing. The difference is more than cosmetic. Cassia dominates the global market, making up the vast majority of cinnamon in circulation. Meanwhile, Sri Lanka produces nearly 90% of the world's Ceylon cinnamon, a fragile minority in a trade worth around $700 million a year. For the modern shopper, the choice often is not a choice at all. The label may promise cinnamon, but what is inside is usually a stand-in, a centuries-old substitution hiding in plain sight. In the world of cinnamon, the difference between legend and label can come down to a single compound. Cassia, the industrial workhorse of the spice aisle, carries up to 63 times more coumarin than true Ceylon cinnamon. Coumarin is a natural flavor, but in high doses it has drawn the attention of regulators. In Germany, public health authorities have issued advisories about cinnamon-laced holiday treats, and across the European Union, strict limits now cap coumarin in foods at 2 milligrams per kilogram. These are not warnings for the faint of heart. They are the result of lab tests, high-performance liquid chromatography separating bark from bark, myth from measurable fact. For the modern shopper, the story ends not with a bonfire, but with a label and a choice. The real risk may not be what is in your cupboard, but what you never thought to question. Centuries ago, a Roman emperor burned his sorrow into smoke, while Dutch captains called cinnamon the noblest of all merchandise. Today, supermarket shelves blur Ceylon and Cassia, and Germany quietly warns of Coumarin. The world still pays for illusions sold as truth. Taste carefully. The myth endures.